Our presenter tonight is so excited to have Bob Hollingworth. He is one of the leading hybridizers in Siberian irises, as I know we are all aware. Bob, you'll hear from Bob's accent that he was born and grew up in Yorkshire in the north of England. But he has been in the US, I think, since the 60s, if I'm not mistaken. Bob is currently in Michigan, mostly a retired Professor Emeritus up there. I think something sciencey, right? And he has had several award-winning irises, well, many award-winning irises, and perhaps the one that is most famous is Swans in Flight, which is the first and only Siberian hybridized to ever win the Dykes Medal, which is, of course, the premier best iris in the world, kind of best iris in the country, bestowed by the American Iris Society. So with that, I'm delighted to turn it over to Bob.
Okay, let me do the share screen setup here and we'll get going. Welcome to everybody. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. It's always nice to see some new green things and flowers at this time of year. So let's get on and do that. Is that showing up okay?
Perfect.
Good. Okay, so we're going to talk about Siberian irises and growing them and so on and so forth. First question you might ask is, why would I want to do that? Why persuade me that that I should do that? And so we'll start off talking about some of the sort of general merits of Siberians first off. And we're going to go through all of the things that I would think are the basics about getting to understand them as we go through this. So let's get started. And they have several real benefits as flowering plants. One of them is what I would call accent plants, that is growing on their own away from everything else and making a point that you sort of notice and look at as you go through the garden or wherever you might be. A couple of examples of that one on either side, sky mirror, ginger twist. They should really look like bouquets of flowers when they're growing well, like you could almost take a knife, cut them off at ground level, put them in a vase, and you would have a flower arrangement. You wouldn't want to do that to the plant, but you could think about it. So accent plants is one thing. Waterside, they sort of have an affinity for being by the water somehow when you look at them. And the last thing is they mix in very well with other perennial plants in mixed planting. And I'll show you a few pictures along the way just to demonstrate that. We showed some free standing ones. There's another one. This is we're going to mention Schaefer Sachs, that is Marty Schaefer and Jan Sachs from Massachusetts, who are great hybridizers and have won many, many medals. That's one of theirs called Painted Woman, just a perfect looking Siberian iris. Here's another one, Charming Darlene, that I took at Michigan State University's garden a few years back. And then we mentioned Swans in Flight just in passing. But it's an interesting question because that won the Dykes in 2016. Not only the only Siberian to win it, the only beardless iris to ever win the Dykes. And you might say, whoa, how the heck did it do that? And the answer is that it has big flowers. You can see how big some of them are. And it makes a great clump. And you can just see the mass of flowers that shoot up on it. And it did that at several conventions and got enough attention that in the end it did win the Dykes Medal. So that's one of my proudest moments. But it does show the clumping effect and the importance of that. Waterside, well, we'll go quickly through that. They go very nicely by the water. One on the right I took at Golden Gate Park in San Francisco a few years back, and I was there about a week early. You can see if those buds had opened, it would have been quite a show, but I wasn't there that week. Another one taken out in the Pacific Northwest. Another one, I don't know where that came from, but looking like they fit by the water. And then in mixed plantings, they do very well. They play well with other ornamentals. There's a picture with some Shasta daisies, poppies, they bloom at the same time and look good with them. Peonies, they bloom at the same time and complement each other very nicely. Some other things, Weigelia, that was taken in our backyard a couple of years ago. Primulas, very nice combination there of colors. And the last one, lupins. They bloom at the same time and seem like they make an interesting contrast. So lots of ways you can use them in a garden, and they will reward you for that. So that's the sort of thing why we do this. And let's take a look at what it is that we're doing it with. And this is a bit of a botanical thing, so I don't expect anyone particularly to learn all these iris species names. One thing though, if you look halfway down there, you'll see subseries Chrysographes, 40 chromosomes. And above it, subseries Siberici, 28 chromosomes. I suspect there are some people in the audience who didn't even know there were two different kinds of Siberian iris. And the second group, the 40 chromosome ones, you will not be able to grow well or at all in Kentucky, nor can we do that in Michigan. About the only place they grow really well is the Pacific Northwest, because they do not like hot, humid weather. And we get plenty of that. So eventually, if you do have one, it'll probably maybe last a year or two. They're very pretty flowers, but it'll quit sooner or later. Kind of like the Pacific Coast natives don't like it out here either. So what we deal with, and all the ones that you've probably seen, or unless you've been to conventions in the Pacific Northwest, are those 28 chromosome ones, the top group. And three species there, Iris sanguinica, Iris siberica. Note it doesn't have an E in the middle of it. A lot of people like to put it there, but that's not how it's spelt. And Iris typhifolia, the three species that make up the ones that we use in the garden, or that we're familiar with in the garden. So what are their characteristics? Well, where do they come from? That tells you a lot about where they will grow well. And here we can see on the left, Iris siberica in the blue area. Starts off over in the sort of eastern part of Europe and goes right across into the steppes of Russia. And it may actually even go further east than that, but that's about where it's been described. And the others in the group, Iris sanguinica is an oriental species, grows all the way from Japan across China to Mongolia and southern Russia. And the third one I mentioned, typhifolia, grows in the same sort of general region as that, so it overlaps pretty well. None of them grow native in the United States. And then just to mention that for the last time, those 40 chromosomes that we can't grow, why is that? That's because down there, they're growing up in the high mountains of the Himalayas. And they are near the equator, so it never gets that cold, but it sure as heck never gets hot and humid either. And that's what they really don't like. So that sort of explains why we don't see them very much out in our area. So there, the other ones are growing in temperate areas, sort of mid-north latitudes, out there in meadows and plains and the edges of woods and so on. These are the characteristics of the species. And Siberica is, generally speaking, fairly small flowers compared to what we grow typically in the garden. Has lots of them. You can see on the right a white version of one. Quite a lot of buds and good branching. I mean, maybe I've seen as many as 7, 8, 9 buds on one of these in the species range. And generally held quite nicely above the foliage. Very pleasant, pretty wildflower if you grow it for that. And then Siberica is a little bit different. Sanguinia is a little different. Bigger flowers, not so much veining on them. I don't have a pointer, I don't think, with this. Oh yeah, can you see the pointer on there? Anyway, on the left, you will see that the space that the flower came out of is a sort of reddy brown color. That's where it gets its name. Sanguinia means bloody, and it reminded somebody of blood color, I guess. Anyway, they often have only 2 buds, and their flowers are not high above the foliage typically. They are held just above the foliage. And that form has been pretty dominant for quite a long time in the breeding of Siberians because of one that we'll talk about a little later called white swirl, that is a sanguinia. And the way the form of that and its nice white color took over almost entirely until recently, the kind of genetics of breeding the Siberians that we know. So those are the two main ones. And then we have the third one, Iris typhifolia. Oops, don't want that. There we go. It's only been around since the 80s and 90s, was rediscovered in China. It doesn't look a whole lot different from the others. It's got very narrow spirally foliage. And the big thing that it has contributed is that it blooms very early. And so if you make crosses with that, and there are a number of them out there now, named ones, you will find that it will bloom certainly before the TBs, and maybe around the time that the MTBs are in full bloom, you'll get the first Siberians showing up. So if you want an earliest versions, you get ones with typhifolia in there. They're all very similar. They all breed together nicely. They combine without any kind of problem to make hybrids. As I say, they come from the sort of temperate areas of the world, not too hot, not necessarily too cold. Mountain areas, often damp in the spring as the snow melts off and runs through there. Can be drier in the summertime, but basically cool, moist, acidic to neutral soil. Out there in meadows, in other words. They're pretty easy to grow in the cooler parts of the United States. They can take some heat. I mean, we get up in Michigan to into the 90s in the summertime, and it may be a bit dry. I won't say they like that, but they'll tolerate it. And so they will handle those kind of conditions quite nicely. They do have to have a winter cooling period in order to set them up for flowering for the next year. And so for various reasons, they're not going to grow well in the southernmost states of the United States, zone 8 or higher. They're probably not going to be doing too well. They're very hardy. They go right up into zone 3 at least. I mean, up towards Alaska almost, and can take very strong winter low temperatures. And as I mentioned, they do cross quite readily among each other. So you can mix all these things together. And let's take a look at how that proceeded from the sort of history of Siberian iris breeding. And you can, if you want to choose a bit, perhaps arbitrarily, certain points where something happened that changed the direction of the field, those are probably the ones. Starting out in the early days, people didn't make crosses too much at that time. They grew bee pods if they were growing anything at all. Whoops, we just lost the light. And mainly blue or white. Caesar's brother we'll talk about as we go through this. Some of the typical older ones are Kingfisher on the left, from Dykes himself, who gave his name to the medal. Perry's Blue, Amos Perry in England, who bred that one. Both of those are sanguinea. And Snow Queen, which was collected in Japan. It's just a collected version. So those were the things that if you were 100 years ago, been growing Siberians in your garden, that's what you would have been growing. And the sort of next stage you can identify as being a real step forward was this Iris Caesar's brother, which anybody who knows Siberians has heard of. It is an amazing plant, still widely grown today, although it was 1931 when it was introduced. It probably grows better than other Siberian down in the southern part of the range, quite amazing. You'll see them growing beautifully down in Texas and way down in what I call the southern part of the zone. It came from a controlled cross, and it was a sanguinea by a Siberica, so maybe we got some hybrid vigor here, crossing the two species together. And it got the Morgan Award, which is then the top award for Siberians, named after Mr. Morgan, a Canadian who introduced it. You can tell how important an iris was to a considerable extent by how well its progeny did. And we can just show these. This was Tealwood that came straight out of Caesar's brother, won the Morgan Award in '65. This is Dewfall, Magave, Morgan Award 1970. Ego, another Magave's, Morgan Award 72. So it's a distinguished parent, and it still is used from time to time by people. Okay, let's move on to the next stage. That gave us the controlled crosses and sanguinea by Siberica. And this is White Swirl, another very famous iris. Fred Casimir introduced it in 1957. He very fortunately changed the name he first started off. He wanted to call it Frank Stubbs, the Irish name. Not really too distinguished as a name, named after his gardener. And then someone persuaded him, no, it's a good Irish, don't call it Frank Stubbs, call it White Swirl. And poor Mr. Stubbs lost his big claim to fame in life, I think, when that change was made. Anyway,
No
here it is.
picture.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes.
Go ahead. Okay. So that's what White Swirl is. And why was it interesting? Because it has almost parallel out falls. They stand out at right angles rather than dangling down. And they have that sort of swirly pattern. And they're absolutely beautifully pure white, crystal pure white. And it caught everybody's attention at that time, and all the hybridizers started using it, and that launched us into what is the sort of white swirl age, if you want to think about it, which lasted right on through the 60s, 70s, even into the 80s. Here are some examples of what it's done as a direct parent, as one of the parents, Super Ego, Morgan Award 71, Ruffled Velvet, Curry McEwen, 1980, Marjorie Brummett in England won 2 British Dykes medals with her Cambridge and anniversary. They're both there. And as late as 1991, Calvin Helsley was using White Swirl as a one parent and got a Morgan Wood. It was now a medal for the best Siberian in 1991. So it dominated the breeding because of its characteristics. And then we can move ahead one more stage and look at Butter and Sugar, Curry McEwen. Why is that special? Because it's the first truly yellow Siberian in this group. The 28 chromosomes did not have any yellow until he line bred this into them. And that started out a huge number of possibilities that still ramify today, not only of getting yellow irises, but of getting combinations of the yellows and the lavenders and the red violets and so on, which dominate things pretty much today. And of course, getting yellow Siberians now is no trick. People don't even walk over to look at them necessarily. There's nothing unusual. Those are just some of them, a couple that we did, and SS's Schaefer-Sachs. They've done quite a few. The one on the right there is one of my most favorite ones, and it just grows very beautifully. Whoops, I'm screwing things up here. Well, and somehow the name's gone out at the bottom of it. You can see from Laugh Out Loud there that in fact we are now getting yellow bitones. They don't have to be aminas. You can get yellow right throughout the whole plant. The name of the one I was talking about that's shown as a clump there, and again, a beautiful clump, is Tree of Songs. And that is one of the nicest ones. It always makes a nice clump like that. So that was big, and there's a lot of follow-up to that we're going to talk about, using the yellow as a base for other color combinations. But the first one was Butter and Sugar. And Curry McEwen did another thing that advanced things very greatly, and that is making tetraploids. He produced them in the early 70s, and these have 4 sets of chromosomes rather than 2 sets of chromosomes. Wild Siberians, in fact, almost all the beardless iris are diploid. They have the typical 2 sets of chromosomes, one from each parent. But you can double that number up, and then they've got more chromosomes and more genetic material to make more different things, and that's it. Incidentally, most of the bearded iris are already tetraploids. Tetraploid plants are very common in nature, and the bearded iris are all tetraploids, just as nature has set them up. But you have to work at it to get tetraploid beardless ones, and you usually do that by treating them with a compound called colchicine, and that in its own way doubles up the chromosome number. And what do you get as a result? Why even do that? Well, it has its pluses and minuses. You tend to get bigger flowers, heavier substance, more ruffling, I think sometimes more intense colors, but not always, broader foliage, and unfortunately, shorter stems. And you've no idea, I do a lot with tetraploids, you've no idea how frustrating it can be to have a really fine new iris and it blooms 2 inches short of the foliage and you can never do anything with it. And that's not atypical of tetraploids. So they have to go on the rubbish heap. Vigor, well, it's at least as good as the diploids and maybe a little bit better in many cases. And the other thing is that they don't readily interbreed because the chromosome numbers don't match up well. And so they remain as sort of 2 independent lines of breeding once you've got the tetraploids. Let's take a look at a few of those and see what they look like. Call it the evolution. That was the very first one. And it really, by today's standards, isn't terribly interesting. It was a marvel that it existed at all, but it's kind of narrow and it's plain and rather species-like. Over the next 30, 40 years, some good things happened. I think good from the point of view of making them more interesting. Those are a couple of hours. And you see the heavy ruffling that you can get, even that bubble ruffling over there on Judy, Judy, Judy. And the bigger, rounder form, and so that they can make complete circles of the falls. And here's a couple of other ones, just as examples. I'm not the only person that does this. Dean Cole and Jeff Dunlop in Maine have worked with this, and you can see some of the ones that they've done. My First Kiss makes a lovely clump. It's just beautiful, clump iris. Yellow's been a difficult one. I won't go into that, but it's been a bit of a struggle to get good. I don't know why, just luck of the draw maybe, but there are not that many good yellow tetraploid Siberians yet. And here's another thing that led the field forward, and this is in a sense a kind of revolt against white swirl, and that is going back to Iris siberica, the species. And you'll see there snow prints, which is a pure Iris siberica, not quite as clean a white, which is maybe why people didn't use them always. A little bit sort of gray white on the falls, but it's a form that was ignored for many years because everyone was chasing these big round flaring plants. And the Schaefer-Sachs pair, so I thought, well, why don't we go back to this form and do something with it? And they did, and they did some remarkable things. Here's just a couple of the many that they've done. You can see Banished Misfortune, relatively small flowers held up there and with quite a few of them to open bloom. And that's Banished Misfortune. It got the Morgan Wood Medal in 2011. And So Van Gogh is another that got Morgan Wood in 2012. So they really hit the jackpot with this idea of changing the focus on it, not to mean you don't still do the other kind, but this now was in people's view. I did mess around with this a little bit, but nothing like they did. White Amber is one of theirs, and I've always thought that was a lovely plant. I love it. It grows as a beautiful clump and it's quite vigorous and so on and so forth. So I've grown it for quite a while. And I started to make some crosses with it. And out of that, we got Lemon Mousse in 2012. And then one with some quite different coloring, but it does come right out of there, Hot, Hot, Hot in 2015. So those lines do continue. And we have a lot of different possibilities now when you're into the breeding of Siberians. Even more so, we have some more mutant forms. Most irises have these. In fact, the Japanese iris, as you're well familiar, they're full of these 6-4 multi-petal things. The Siberians only more recently got into that mode. And again, those original irises came over from Japan. They were being grown over there. And then they've been worked on in the US. And I'll show you some of the results that are ongoing here. First of all, the multi-petal group. This is John Bauer and Bob Coble at Ensata Gardens did a lot of the early work on these, and that's Kaboom. And if you look at that, you can see it's interesting. It seems to have lots of falls, probably 6 of them, rather than the usual 3. It has no reproductive parts, no anthers, none of that. What it does have then growing up through the middle is a second flower. And so it's what they call hose in hose. And so it's not a complete second flower, but you can see it's got a second lot of falls in that middle section bit. And so with Kaboom, you could get 15, 20, 25 petaloids, making a very different form and an interesting one too, that's novel. Here's another of theirs called Imperial Opal, where you can see sort of layers of petals and petaloids there. We done quite a bit and continue to do it with this particular format. That was one of ours that we introduced a couple of years ago called Petalicious. And that has adapted now a form that we see a lot of, where it's got 3 falls, 6 petals, 6 standards, and then a sort of new flower starting to grow up through the middle of it to repeat that whole process. And then another one that we introduced a little earlier called Double Play, and that's pure white with a sort of yellow center to it. So you might say, well, I like mine plain and simple and the way that nature intended. I'm not sure that these aren't the way nature intended too, since they're spontaneous mutations. But if you do find a little novelty with them, they do make very interesting, different versions of a Siberian iris. And then the other thing that came from Japan was 6 falls. Those are the things that with these days, if you see them with some of the others, they call flatties. I'm not sure I like the name, but let's use it. That's Roko Oji that Hiroshi Shimizu sent. And Roko Oji, being translated, means 6 princes. And that was one of the nicer ones that came from Japan. But now you can see that it's got all 6 falls, and it doesn't have any standards at all. That was one that we did, 6 Love. That's all fall type. And then a more recent one we introduced just last year was Pure Flattery. And again, you can see the fact that they're all 6 falls there. It's an interesting format. It's been a very difficult one to work with because the genetics are a little screwy. But it's one that I almost gave up on, but I'll show you right at the end something that happened this very year that's kept me going with it. So all sorts of things you can work with: tetraploids, diploids, Siberica forms, sanguinea forms, 6 falls, multi-petals, whole world's open there. Let's take a look at a few recent introductions. And these are sort of almost not quite at random, but there's so many that you can't show them all. Just to show you what's going on at the moment, shall we? Jeff Dunlop still working on his tetraploids. There's Crimson Fireworks. You can see a very typical tetraploid form, very round, very ruffled, strong colors. And another of his called Edge of Tomorrow. And then this is Terry Aiken. Terry does a lot of breeding, as most of you know. He doesn't do a lot with Siberians, but he does work with them regularly. And this brings up a topic I'm not really going to talk a whole lot about, and that is repeat bloom and continuous bloom. And obviously with most irises, it'd be kind of nice if they would bloom for longer. And these particular lines he's been working with do have extended bloom. He says in his conditions out there in Washington State, it never gets really hot and they will continue to throw up blooms all summer. I don't see that, because once it heats up to sort of summer temperatures, they do stop. But they do have an extra week or 2 of bloom, even for us. And it's something I was working on originally, and I'm combining his things with mine to see if we can get that extension of the bloom season. Burgundy Fireworks is one of them that grows nicely for us, extended bloom. And that's one he just introduced this last year, Cream of the Crop. And that one too grows well and blooms for a little bit longer than your average Siberian iris will do. I recommend it, it's a nice iris. So those are a couple of them. Then let's move on to some of the ones that the Schaefer-Sachs combo has put out. And they have really worked this area, blending the yellow background with red, violet, or blue colors to get some really new things in the oranges and browns and cinnamons and all those sort of toasty, spicy colors, and really worked that area beautifully over the last, 15, 20 years, I imagine. Here are some examples. There they are, Marty Schaefer and Jen Sachs. And one of the things that having yellow under there does, it just slightly increases the pinkness that you see in a flower. and that's one called Fancy Me This, which is a little pinker than most Siberians have been. Here you can see the really spicy colors you get by mixing red, violet, and yellow together. That's Paprikash, which won the Morgan Wood Medal about 2018, I imagine. Butterscotch Fizz, one of my great favorites. It draws beautifully for us, and I just love that color combination. And the yellow is turned into a more sort of butterscotch because it's got a very faint lavender underneath it. These are all very new colors, I mean. The blue and yellow don't mix as well as the reds and yellows, but there are some quite interesting ones, and that's one of theirs where they've got a yellow base with blue on top of it, Art in Bloom. And then a last one, which is pretty striking. Boy, that's bloomed very nicely for us this year, called Festive Coquette. And that's got about everything, new, different colors, an edging effect, lots of ruffles and big flower, and it's pretty special. So they've done great things with these combinations. It's not the only thing they do, I'll stress, but I just thought I'd bring that particular part of their breeding program to your attention. And then there's this guy. We've done a lot of tetraploids in our time. Hail to the chief, big flouncy thing. Something shocking, which has I call, it's a plicata like Siberian, if you like that, with just the rim of color. Neptune's Gold, which has a nice contrast and really makes a beautiful clump. It's won its awards. I don't do just tetraploids. There's a diploid, Icaramba. And again, you can see there's some change in the quality of the red on the falls by having that bright gold underneath them. And Golden Hearted, which is interesting because it starts out with all yellow falls, and over the first day, the outer rim disappears, and then you've got this sort of thumbprint. So it's kind of fun to watch happen. It turns itself into a spuria, essentially, or something like that. But it transforms itself over a day quite a lot. And then this last one, Sapphire Starburst, is an introduction that's coming out this year in the Ensata catalogue. So again, that's a tetraploid, big flouncy flower, and got that sort of, looks like a supernova explosion going on in the middle of the falls. So those are some of the sort of modern ones that you will see. And hey, if you win this door prize for the Ensata Gardens, you can probably pick almost any of these out if you so choose. I don't know quite how it'll work, but they're all in their catalogue. Okay, well, let's change topics now and talk about culture. How do you grow these things successfully? And what are the limitations? What are the best ways to do it? And a lot of people have different ways. I don't pretend to know the best way always, but this is what we've learned over time. I said they're very hardy. They can take all sorts of cold. They need some cold, and they do best when the springs are a little bit cool and slow in developing. And that's not always the case here, and I'm sure it's not always the case with you guys down in Kentucky and the surrounding areas. But they like a sort of slow development to blooming to look at their very best. They like moisture. And particularly in the spring, if you get a wet spring, it's no problem. But they are, I stress, not bog plants. They do not grow well or at all if their feet are in the water itself. They like to be wet, but not boggy. They can take some dryness, as I think I mentioned, but year-round moisture is what they like best, and if they can have it. They're not real fussy about soil pH. 5.5 to about 7.5 is possible. And they'll grow in almost any kind of soil, except, like most plants, they're not particularly happy in a very heavy clay soil. But pure sand, I've seen them growing in, and as long as they get enough water, they'll be happy. They do need sun, like almost all irises. And of course, if you're in a hot climate with hot summers, probably some afternoon shade won't hurt them at all. It'll help them to keep a bit cool. And the last thing is fertilizing, and at a minimum, I would put something like a 10-10-10 typical balanced fertilizer on there in the spring. and it would not in any way hurt to put a second application on after they stop blooming. There is a difference here between them and the TBs. Most, I think, probably true, that most beardless irises like fertilizer. If you're growing a lot of TBs, you're cautious about using nitrogen because it's supposed to make them have big fat rhizomes, and then they're subject to rot, and it's not good for them. But that's not true with the Siberians. They don't have big fat rhizomes and they don't rot. So you can lay some fertilizer on them, and they don't have to have it, but they will probably do better for you if you give them a fair amount of fertilizer during the year. You don't have to hold back. Transplanting, well, again, these are different than the bearded iris, like most beardless iris. You can do it in the spring, which is not a bad time to do it. You can do it in the fall or late summer. You would not want to do it without a lot of precautions in the middle of summer. The main reason being that if it gets too hot, it puts too much stress on the root system, and it's going to fry up. And they do have to be watered quite nicely after you transplant them for them to establish growth and get their roots down. Moisture keeps coming up here, and it is a factor for getting them to grow well. And particularly after you transplant them, they do not want to go dry. When do you have to do it? Well, as long as they look good, you don't ever have to do it. But a lot of them do eventually develop a hollow center. You get a sort of massive woody rhizome growing out there, and it varies with cultivar. And when you do get something that's starting to look untidy, or you're getting diminished clump effects, you typically dig them up, throw the woody stuff away, replant the bits, and start again. But I can't say when it has to be done, because sometimes it's years, sometimes it's 2 or 3 years, depends on the plant and how it's growing. This is critical, and again, let me stress, it's not like the bearded iris. The roots have to remain moist during the transplanting and shipping process. You cannot, with these, do what you'd often might do with TBs that arrive at an inconvenient time from someone who sent them and toss them in the corner of the garage for a couple of weeks until you get around to planting them. They won't be there by the time you get to that. They have to have moist roots. They don't have to be soggy, but at least don't let them dry out until they're really, really dry. And then when you do, you plant them with the crown about 2 inches, 1 to 2 inches, not with the surface, down a little deep. Get those roots down into the nice soil and keep them damp until they're established. Since they like moisture, there's a lot to be said for mulching them, particularly in the first year with some straw or leaves or something like that. Helps to keep the soil cool and the weeds down and the moisture in. But it also, in the wintertime, gives a nice little home for rodents, and I will mention voles in the wintertime. So I don't usually keep the mulch on for the wintertime if I apply it during the summer. So what do you have to worry about here? What kind of problems do we have? Well, we have insects, and you guys know just as well as I do about iris borers, I'm sure. There are a few other things that don't bother them here too much. There's a bud fly that chews the buds, and that gives the people out on the East Coast, some places, a lot of problems because it just chews the buds up before the flowers open. We don't see those very much in our area. I don't know if you do in yours. We've had problems once in a while with white grubs chewing the roots if you don't keep control on the Japanese beetle grubs and so on and so forth. But again, it's not been a common thing. The one big bad thing is iris borers. We'll talk about that. Diseases, not very much at all, but we'll mention that, and then the furry critters. So I hardly need to say very much about iris borers. You've seen them, I think. I certainly have. We got a problem with them at the moment. And there's a little baby one just hatched out, starting to chew its way down the side of the iris leaf. And as soon as it can, it's going to get right down inside the folds of that leaf and get away from the world so it can eat in peace. And so that unless you've got something in the way of a chemical control that gets into the plant and catches it while it's feeding inside, the only place you get them is by spraying them at that early stage with most of the insecticides available. Just another example, and we don't hardly need to show it. And then that is not from a Siberian, it's from a tall bearded, but we all know those fat, greasy, pinkish iris borer grubs. At least if you don't know them, you've been blessed, because most people who grow irises eventually meet face to face with those babies. Nasty things. What can you do about it? Well, one of the things that I didn't used to believe was all that effective, perhaps, but the more I look at it, the more I think it probably is quite effective, is to clean out and destroy the old foliage in the fall. Not before, because they're still laying their eggs, the iris borers, up until into the late summer. And it's laid on the existing foliage and of the iris. So if you wait until early fall, take the foliage off and destroy it, you'll get rid of a lot of the eggs that way. The problem is, if like me, you grow probably a couple of acres, that's a lot of work. And so it's not really possible on a huge scale. But if you're growing, just a bed or two of irises, that's not such a big job to do. And burn the old foliage or get it out of your backyard, and you'll take a lot of the eggs that were laid there that will hatch out in the next spring and give you new borers. They'll be gone. So it's a useful thing to do. After that, we are largely into insecticides, which of course not everybody is keen on using, I appreciate. Used to be that Saigon, the common name is dimethoate, was the standard that a lot of people used. About 15 years ago, EPA decided that it shouldn't be used by homeowners, and only commercial operators are allowed legally to use it. It still is legal to use it, but you have to have a commercial operation. It is systemic in that it goes into the plant, and as the plant munches on the insides of your iris, it's munching on the dimethoate, and it will kill it. That's a good thing to do. There's a compound called orthene that might replace that and is still allowed for use. Most people have gone over to using another compound, another insecticide that is systemic, moves in the plant, and that's merit. Common name is Imidacloprid. And if you apply that particularly in the spring, around the time the forsythias are blooming or a little afterwards, it gets taken up by the plant. It lasts quite a long time in the plant. You probably only need to use it once, I imagine, and it will kill some of the borers. A couple of problems here with merit. Number one is that is a class of chemistry that isn't real good at killing caterpillars, which is what you're dealing with here. It's much better at killing sucking insects like mites and flea beetles and things that suck on it, aphids. It will kill them, but I'm never really sure that it's the best thing you could use. The other thing, which is an increasing problem, is that it can be toxic to bees. And that's become a thing of course, major interest, major concern. And since it's in the nectar and to some degree in the pollen, the bees can get enough of it that it might affect their behavior. It is probably not the major reason why we have this colony collapse and loss of bees. That's due to pests, to mites and viruses, but it's well possible that imidacloprid may play a role in it too, and it's been under EPA review because of that. So you may choose not to use that, but you don't have a lot of other choices. If you want to go organic, there are a couple of compounds, spinosad, which is called Conserve as a trade name, or the Bacillus thuringiensis toxins like Dipel. Both of those will be control the little larvae, but only when they're out on the surface of the leaf. And so once they get inside, they're not going to do anything for you. And you would need to respray your plants maybe a couple of times during the course of the early mid-spring to make sure you get all of those babies. Not too convenient. The last thing I put there is because we may have something new on the horizon, a compound with a quite unpronounceable common name, cyanotraniliprole. Commercial name is mainspring. if it's a new group of insecticides that have come on the market. They are systemic. This one is, not all of them. This particular one is, and it's very good at killing caterpillars. I have seen no work that's been done to show it actually kills borers, but I would be surprised if it didn't. And the only knock on it is that it's expensive, and you have to buy enough to treat about 2 acres, and it costs you $300. So that may be discouraging. Hopefully one of these days they get it down to a smaller amount that, say, a homeowner could use, and then it may give us a new set of chemistry for controlling borers that is better off. Let me share one other thing with you about borer control, since it's something that dominates my mind often enough during the season, and that's this. And I got this from an article that Terry Lauren in Canada wrote called Winning the Borer War. It was in the Irises magazine in 2018. And he said that putting these UV light traps out in the late summer and early fall, from August into early September, when the adult moths of the iris borer, that's what the ones on the right are, those are adult iris borer moths. They're out there looking for a place to lay their eggs. They're attracted to UV light, like a lot of insects are, and they'll fall in the trap and die there. And I put one up this year just to see how it went at one end of our iris area. And I got about 20 or 30, and I didn't get started at the beginning of the season. Whether that's enough to give control, I don't know. But Terry says that after he'd been using these light traps for 2 or 3 years, his borer problem had diminished to being not a problem at all. So he was happy with how they worked, and it's a potential alternative for handling the borer problem. So we'll see how it works in our place over the next couple of years. Moving on. What about diseases? Wow, this is where Siberians come into their own. They don't really have any serious diseases. There's no leaf spot. They don't get bacterial rhizome rot. Those are both bearded iris, of course, that are in the picture there. You can see, but not very often, botrytis. If you get a very cold, wet spring, you might see some of this sort of thing around the outer edge of a plant. The outer leaves die and dry up, and you can pull them off quite easily, and they sort of dry at the base. If you have a plant that does that all the time, or it causes it to look ugly, my suggestion is dig it up and throw it away. You can use fungicides to control this, but I don't know of any Siberian iris that's worth growing if you have this kind of thing happening all the time. Most of them are pretty resistant and don't do it. And then the same could be said about this. It's crown rot. It's probably a fungal disease when it's very hot and wet. And you'll see occasionally you'll lose some a shoot or two to this. But this is not a major problem for most of the time, for most of the Siberians. It's just something that occasionally happens. And the third thing that I'd be interested to know whether you, oh no, this is another thing, this is furry creatures. Big thing about this with like most irises is deer don't like them. I'm not saying that a deer, and particularly a young one, won't sort of chew on one for a while to see if maybe it's good to eat, but they don't continue and they don't usually come back. And that's one of the great positives about Siberians and irises in general. You don't have to do any deer protection, which we live out towards the woods and we're surrounded by the damn things and they eat everything in sight except irises. But we do see a problem, and that's this. Not every year, but some years, I think you get population explosions with voles from time to time. And you see there that the picture, there's this whole sort of brown massy stuff in the middle there at the bottom of the iris. And that is what used to be the iris that the vole has chewed up the rhizomes and made a little nest for itself in there in the wintertime. And obviously caused a lot of damage, didn't completely kill it, but they can. And so they can be a nuisance. And those are the dudes. I'm assuming that guy had a stuffed vole there because they bite and you do not want to handle them. But how do you get rid of them? Well, you can put out bait for them if you're really concerned about it. that's my answer. Biological control, the ultimate weapon. It's have a couple of cats, and they might do about as well for you with getting the voles under control as anything else would do. So, and that's about the end of the pest problems, really. I'd be interested to know if you have vole problems. A lot of people have said, "Oh yeah, we see that too," and I think they're a bit of more of a problem than sometimes people let on.
Rabbits.
Yeah.
I just planted a whole bunch of Siberians this fall, and I've got rabbits. I also have 4 useless dogs who stare out the door looking at them, but they're rabbits. I've caught them eating them. It's just ridiculous. They've eaten everything this year. Wow. And on certain web chats with plant people, everybody's been complaining about, pardon my language, the damn rabbits this year.
Rabbits, yeah.
Yep.
Well, I have not seen, we have rabbits, but we don't have a huge number of them that I've ever noticed, but I have never really thought they were causing any damage. They've got a lot of other stuff to feed on before they choose the irises. So, yeah, well, shotgun sounds like a good a good answer. You can eat them too. They're pretty tasty. So anyway, yeah, there are occasional other things. We about 2 years ago, I just planted out a whole lot of nice seedlings in rows, and I came in one day, and there were some birds pulling them up. They thought they were corn, I guess. Whatever it was, and that's the only time I've ever seen it. You know, just once in 30 years, and suddenly there's a bunch of birds there decide that they want to see what's under them or something of that kind. So you can run into these things from time to time. It's wild out there. I hope you have good luck with your rabbits anyway. Okay, let's move to the very last part of this, and I thought it might be fun to look at a few of the things that we have in the works, either possible introductions or just interesting new seedlings, just a few of them, and show you what's really going on in the garden at the moment. That's one that is very likely one for introduction next year. It comes from colchicine treatment, and it looks very much like a tetraploid, but it also breeds as a diploid. It's a kind of a weird one, but it's a very striking flower. It catches your eye every time you go near it in the garden. So that may well be an introduction next year. At the moment, it only has the seedling number. That's a multi-petal. It's actually a Sib of Petalicious that we showed earlier, but much darker colors. I think that's a likely introduction next year. This is a seedling. That is by far the deepest yellow Siberian I ever saw. And it's got some sisters and brothers, but it's only a 2018, so it's got a long way to go to prove itself in terms of growth and looking good as a clump and so on. But I've been using it as a parent because I just love the depth of that color. And another one that makes it just a beautiful clump with the kind of dotty yellow pattern on the falls. We'll see how that does. And then the last lot, some other ones that have struck me. That's one that really does show a lovely combination of the yellows and the sort of lavender pink. And I don't know whether it's orange or pink. It's a sort of both at once kind of one, but it's unlike any other I've seen in terms of colors. That's a tetraploid that I've liked with a sort of plum color and the different top. And very last of all, last picture. And that's what got me back to doing the 6 fall ones. I made my very last crosses and I thought, yeah, if I don't get much out of this, I have other things I can do with my time. And up pops that. And I have no idea where that vein pattern came from because neither parent has it. And several of them in the cross do. Again, that's got a 20 number, 20 M5B2. It only flowered for the first time this year, and it has got a long way to go to prove itself. But I just thought it was a kind of fascinating looking flower. So it's going to be an interesting one to see how it and its brethren do over the next few years. So that's it. We covered the waterfront there. I will show a couple of pictures. That's what our seedling patch looked like a couple of 3 years ago. and or part of it. That's the bottom half. There's a top half as well, and so it's nice. It looks kind of neat. That's looking up towards the house during the bloom season. And I know it's not a short trip, but if any of you do find yourself up towards Michigan in early June, you're very, very welcome to drop by and come and take a look. And you can make a nice trip of it. Ensata Gardens, with all of their stuff, is just a little bit down the road from us. And then the Copelands, Jim and Jill, grow huge numbers of every kind of iris, and they're next door to Ensata. So you can have a nice day looking at gardens up in this part of Michigan if you get there in sort of early mid-June. So you'd be very welcome. And just two other things. One of them, there's some sources of Siberians if you're interested in them. And if you want, I can put this on a slide or a piece of paper, and send it around to anybody who gives me their email addresses and send you an email with this. Similarly, here we have invitation to join. Obviously, we like our members in the Siberian Iris. You get the magazine on the right, the Siberian Iris, twice a year. And you can sign up by contacting my wife, who is the membership secretary, or perhaps even more easily, you go to the SSI, Society of Siberian Iris website, which is a good place to go to look at Siberian pictures, or the AIS website itself and sign up using PayPal there. And, so I hope you will do that. Come and join us, enjoy the fun. There is also, and I didn't mention this because I don't know if anybody's sure whether it's going to be held, but about every 3 years we have a Siberian Iris convention. And this coming year, right in the first week of June, it's going to be out in Washington State. Whether, in fact, the damn virus is going to get in the way of having that in early June, I don't know. Hopefully, we might be over the top by then and people feel like traveling around. Anyway, it's something to keep an eye on. It will be advertised on the AIS and other places too. But the first week of June out in near Seattle is the next Siberian Iris convention. So I think I've said everything I know. Now it's time for questions.
Well, thank you. And as we get back to questions, Bob, if you want to send me those links and the ship information, I'll put that in my next News to Use email to the group, so everybody will have access to that.
Good, will do.
Well, I have a question.
Sure.
So I'm pretty experienced with bearded irises, but I'm pretty new to Siberians, and I've got a beautiful clump of swans in flight that in the next year or so is probably going to need dividing. I need some tips on what do I do once I dig up that big clump. What's the best way to divide it?
Well, an axe. or a hacksaw.
Right.
One of the downsides of Siberians is if you let them grow big, they are just hell to move around. They get roots everywhere. No, literally, I have a Japanese saw that I use to just saw it into pieces and get rid of anything that doesn't look as though it's real healthy and replant the rest just the way you would with any other iris, really. So getting it up out of the ground is the key.
But so once you start hacking it up, what's a reasonable size to leave it in?
It depends a little bit how soon you want to see a big clump again. I don't think that planting anywhere from 3 shoots to 15, 20 would be bad. Probably 15, 20 might be big, but 10 or 12 would be okay. Yeah.
If I'm keeping plenty for myself and I want to share some, then leaving 3 or 4 together is probably the right size.
Typically, if you buy one of these, you will get 3 or 4 shoots. That's the sort of commercial standard, shall we say, for what a good start of a Siberian will be. And that may well bloom the next year, but it may take 2 years at that. It depends how well it grows.
Yeah. Great. Thanks.
Okay. Anybody else?
What's a good time of year to do the division? I know that with a lot of the beardless, it's recommended to not happen until early fall or very late summer.
I think that's the best time, because you want to get them in early enough that they get their roots down for the winter, and you don't get heaving and thawing and that, as winter goes. So I do it up here, but you're going to be later down there. End of August into early September is the time I really get work at transplanting them. You're probably several weeks later than that in Kentucky, but I would say September might be a very good month to put on your calendar to do this with the Siberians.
David, you'll have lots of friends.
I tried to get a hold of a couple clumps as soon as I could when I saw these and it was winning the medal, and I knew that I would want to share some, so I'll be happy to.
Well, good. Appreciate that. Okay, seems like we've satisfied everybody's curiosity.